The morning had begun like any other in Margaret's life. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of her modest suburban home, illuminating the cozy living room where memories of decades seemed to linger in every corner. Family photos lined the walls, her late husband's smiling face in black and white, her son Michael as a boy holding a trophy, and more recently, candid shots of her daughter-in-law, Lila, whose presence had gradually become more central in their lives. Margaret took a deep breath, savoring the quiet and familiar warmth of the home she had nurtured for decades. But that warmth would be shattered in a single, ruthless stroke. The letter had come that morning, delivered in a crisp white envelope with a formal seal. She recognized the name immediately, the law firm handling real estate transactions. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, expecting perhaps a routine notice or a bill. What she found inside was far worse: eviction papers. Her eyes scanned the typed words again and again, as if repetition could make them disappear. Eviction from her own house. The reality sank like a cold weight into her chest. She read further, incredulity giving way to growing panic. The property had already been sold, signed and finalized. She clutched the letter to her chest, heart hammering, mind racing. How could this be? Who could have done this to her? At first, she thought it must be some bureaucratic mistake, a clerical error that could be quickly corrected. But deep down, a gnawing suspicion had begun to form. She thought of Lila, the seemingly sweet and devoted daughter-in-law who had grown increasingly controlling over the past months. Margaret had noticed subtle manipulations, sly suggestions that Michael should handle things or trust Lila with family matters. Could it really be? Could Lila have gone so far as to sell her own mother-in-law's house behind her back? Margaret's mind reeled, but she knew she needed proof before confronting anyone. She thought back to the times Lila had been unusually boastful about her business dealings, the subtle hints that always seemed just a little too self-satisfied. Margaret had never imagined that behind the smiles and polite conversations, Lila could orchestrate something so cruel. She felt a flicker of determination ignite in her chest. She would not be victimized silently. She would uncover the truth. Margaret called Michael, attempting to keep her voice steady, though every word trembled with urgency. "Michael," she said, her tone tight with restrained emotion, "we need to talk about the house." On the other end, his voice was warm, oblivious to the storm that had erupted in his mother's world. He assured her that everything was under control, that Lila had helped handle the paperwork, and that there was no cause for concern. But Margaret could hear the soft pause in his tone, the hesitation that betrayed a kernel of doubt or perhaps a hint of guilt. Her instincts told her this was no mistake. Lila had manipulated her son, using his trust and love for her to carry out a plan Margaret could hardly believe existed. And yet, the letters, the signatures, the legal documents, they all pointed to a meticulous orchestration. Every detail, every forged signature, every carefully phrased sentence had been executed with cold precision. Margaret's hands tightened around the eviction papers, determination replacing fear. She would gather evidence. She would expose Lila, no matter how long it took, and she would reclaim her dignity. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long across the living room, Margaret began her quiet surveillance. She placed her hidden recorder strategically where Lila would never suspect, anticipating moments when the truth might slip in conversation. Every detail mattered. Every laugh, every boast, every careless word could become the weapon she needed. Margaret's heart still pounded, a mixture of fear and righteous anger coursing through her veins. She realized that the betrayal went deeper than just the sale of a house. This was an assault on her life, her memories, and the trust she had placed in her family. The woman she had welcomed into her home, who had been part of family celebrations and quiet moments alike, had become a figure of deceit and ambition, willing to cast aside family bonds for her own gain. As evening fell, Margaret sat quietly in the dim glow of the living room. The eviction notice and legal papers spread before her like an open wound. Her plan was forming, each piece carefully considered. She would not confront blindly. She would strike with undeniable proof, capturing Lila's betrayal for all to witness. And when the day came, the family dinner would be transformed into a stage where the truth would no longer be hidden, where Lila's smiles and sly remarks would crumble under the weight of her own actions. Margaret exhaled slowly, her resolve crystallizing. The house might have been sold, the signatures forged, but the final word had not yet been spoken. She would reclaim her voice, her dignity, and in doing so, force the family to confront the reality they had ignored for too long. The battle lines were drawn, and the first move had already been set into motion. The next morning, Margaret awoke with a restless energy she hadn't felt in years. The house, though legally sold, still stood as a symbol of her life's work and memories, and she refused to surrender it without a fight. Every picture frame, every corner of the living room seemed to whisper reminders of the home she had built with her own hands. Today, she resolved, she would begin the careful process of exposing the woman who had betrayed her. Margaret knew she had to be meticulous. Lila was cunning, always 2 steps ahead, masking deceit behind charm and laughter. Direct confrontation now would be dangerous. It could alert Lila, who might destroy any evidence before Margaret had the chance to use it. No, she needed proof that could not be ignored, something undeniable. A recording in admission, a boast, anything that would reveal the scope of Lila's betrayal. She remembered the subtle hints Lila had dropped over the past weeks, offhand remarks about handling the sale quickly or making sure the paperwork looked perfect, comments that now seemed sinisterly deliberate. Margaret began to reconstruct every conversation, every visit, every interaction, searching for a pattern, for the precise moment when Lila had begun to manipulate Michael. She had always trusted her son's judgment, but Lila had skillfully used that trust against them both. Margaret purchased a small, discreet audio recorder, the kind that could fit in a pocket or be hidden in a decorative item. She placed it on a side table in the living room where Lila frequently relaxed, sipping coffee and speaking freely when she thought no one was listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every casual laugh, every boastful comment Margaret captured felt like a small victory in a war that had only just begun. Days passed, and Margaret maintained a careful watch. Lila visited regularly, unaware that her words were being documented, that every boast about financial cunning and manipulation was recorded for posterity. "You know, Michael is so easy to convince," Lila said one afternoon, her tone light, but Margaret's heart raced as she listened. "Signing the papers was no problem at all. He thinks he's making decisions, but really, he's following me." Margaret's hands trembled as she rewound the recording, listening to the confession over and over. The calm, collected deceit in Lila's voice contrasted sharply with the rising fury and heartbreak Margaret felt. She could already see the confrontation playing out in her mind the family dinner. The recording played loud and clear, leaving no room for denials or excuses. Lila's confidence would crumble, and Michael would have no choice but to witness the truth. Meanwhile, Margaret also began discreetly gathering additional evidence. She reviewed documents, scanned emails, and noted timelines, meticulously connecting the forged signatures to Lila's involvement. Each piece of evidence formed a damning mosaic of deceit, reinforcing the audio recordings and providing an unassailable case. She was careful not to alert Michael too early, knowing he might be torn between his mother and his wife, and that Lila's manipulation had already conditioned him to hesitate. Yet, Margaret also had to manage her own emotions. Every interaction with Lila brought a mix of rage, betrayal, and sorrow. The woman who had once been considered part of the family had now become the architect of destruction. Margaret found herself pacing late at night, replaying scenarios, rehearsing her words, and visualizing the exact moment when justice would be served. Her anger was sharp, but it was paired with strategic patience as knew this confrontation had to be flawless, public, and undeniable. In private, Margaret confided briefly in a trusted neighbor, an elderly friend who had witnessed decades of family drama unfold in their quiet suburban street. "I cannot let her get away with this," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Her friend nodded, understanding the stakes, offering quiet support and advice about carefully preserving the recordings and preparing for the inevitable showdown. By the end of the week, Margaret had everything she needed. The recordings were clear, the documents were irrefutable, and her plan had taken shape in precise detail. She could almost taste the moment of revelation, the justice that would unfold when the family finally confronted the reality of Lila's betrayal. But Margaret knew timing was crucial. The confrontation had to occur when all family members were present, when Lila's bravado could no longer shield her from the consequences of her actions. That evening, as she prepared dinner and arranged the living room for a seemingly ordinary family gathering, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. Every step she had taken, the surveillance, the documentation, the careful orchestration was leading to this point. The betrayal, once hidden behind smiles and casual reassurances, was now trapped, ready to be revealed in its full, undeniable truth. Margaret's resolve hardened. The house might have been sold, but the final reckoning would belong to her. The day of the family dinner arrived with a strange sense of calm, though beneath the surface, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Margaret moved through the kitchen with measured precision, setting the table with the familiar care she had always shown. Plates, silverware, glasses all arranged perfectly, as if nothing were about to shatter the illusion of family harmony. Yet every step she took was deliberate, every gesture infused with the quiet determination of someone who knew that tonight the truth would no longer be hidden. Lila arrived promptly, dressed immaculately, her smile warm but calculated, masking the arrogance and deceit that Margaret now knew were beneath the surface. Michael followed, carrying a bottle of wine and laughing lightly at a joke Lila made, completely unaware of the storm about to erupt. Margaret's heart ached for her son, who had been so easily manipulated, but she reminded herself that tonight was not about blame it, was about revelation. As everyone settled, Margaret poured the wine, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The conversation began innocuously enough, with small talk and laughter that masked the underlying tension. Lila made a casual comment about how smoothly things had gone with the paperwork, and Margaret's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She forced herself to remain calm, her face a mask of polite composure, even as her mind raced with anticipation. When the main course was served, Margaret excused herself briefly, returning with a small device in her hand, the recorder she had hidden earlier, now ready to deliver the evidence that would shatter the illusion Lila had so carefully crafted. She set it on the sideboard, connecting it to the television in the living room, ensuring that every member of the family could witness the betrayal firsthand. Her pulse quickened, but her demeanor remained composed. She knew that the element of surprise was crucial. Margaret began with a gentle tone, almost conversational. "I thought tonight we could have a special family moment," she said, gesturing subtly to the device. "Something I believe everyone should hear." Lila's smile faltered slightly, though she masked it quickly, tilting her head in a curious gesture. Michael looked puzzled but did not interrupt. Margaret pressed play. The recording began, and Lila's voice filled the room. "Michael is so easy to convince," she said, laughing softly. "Signing the papers was no problem at all. He thinks he's making decisions, but really, he's following me." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the room fell silent. Michael's face drained of color as the reality of his wife's manipulation hit him. Lila's confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic as she realized the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Margaret watched carefully, noting every reaction. Michael's eyes shifted between his mother and his wife, torn between disbelief and anger. He opened his mouth, as if to protest, but no words came. The evidence was irrefutable. Lila's attempts to charm and explain dissolved under the weight of her own admissions, captured with Margaret's careful foresight. The tension escalated as Margaret pressed pause, stepping forward. "Lila," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you've manipulated my son, forged signatures, and sold this house without anyone's consent. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Lila's face reddened, her mouth opening and closing, but no coherent response emerged. The room was thick with unspoken accusations, and the heavy atmosphere of betrayal finally laid bare. Margaret then played a second segment of the recording, where Lila had openly bragged about the scheme to a friend over the phone. Every boast, every sly laugh, every admission of deceit played in crystal clarity for all to hear. Michael sank into his chair, his hands gripping the table, his disbelief turning to anger. Lila's attempts to defend herself collapsed under the irrefutable proof. Her carefully constructed facade of innocence had crumbled entirely, leaving her exposed and humiliated. The family watched in stunned silence. Margaret felt a grim satisfaction, tempered by the sadness of seeing her son so conflicted. Yet she knew that tonight justice would finally be served not through confrontation alone, but through undeniable evidence, capturing every word of betrayal. Lila's arrogance had been her undoing, and Margaret's meticulous planning ensured that the truth would not be denied. As the final moments of the recording ended, Margaret stood tall, her voice steady. "This house, my home, was taken from me without my consent. But now, the truth is here, for everyone to see." The air was thick with shock, and for the first time, Lila's posture betrayed defeat. She looked at Michael, pleading silently, but the damage was done. The betrayal could no longer be hidden behind lies, smiles, or excuses. Michael finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with conflicted emotion. "Lila, how could you?" he asked, the weight of realization etched across his face. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing the confrontation had achieved its purpose. The truth was out. The house, the forgery, the manipulation all exposed. The next steps, the decisions, would have to be made in the aftermath of this revelation. Margaret allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that while the confrontation was only the beginning, the power had shifted. The betrayal could not stand unchallenged, and the family, shaken as it was, could no longer ignore the truth. The room remained tense long after the final recording had played. The once lively family dinner had transformed into a stage of shock, disbelief, and raw emotion. Margaret sat with a quiet composure, watching as the devastation she had feared and yet anticipated unfolded. Her son, Michael, looked as if he had aged 10 years in that single evening, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a physical force. Lila, on the other hand, seemed to shrink under the scrutiny of every gaze, her earlier arrogance replaced with panic and desperation. Margaret observed her son carefully. He had always been compassionate, patient, and trusting, and it pained her to see the conflict etched across his face. Torn between loyalty to his wife and recognition of the truth, he grappled with the enormity of Lila's actions. "Mom, Tu had no idea," he stammered, voice breaking with a mix of guilt and anger. "I trusted her. I thought I was doing the right thing." Margaret placed a calming hand on his shoulder, though her own emotions swirled inside her like a storm. "Michael," she said softly, "this is not about blame. It's about facing reality. She sold this house, forged signatures, and manipulated you. You must understand the gravity of what happened." Lila, sensing the moment slipping away, attempted to interject. "Michael, please, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean." Her words fell flat, drowned out by the stunned silence of the room. Margaret had anticipated every defense, every half-hearted excuse, and had prepared for this. The proof was undeniable. There would be no convincing anyone otherwise. Michael's eyes met Margaret's, searching for guidance, for clarity. He realized that the person he had trusted, the woman he had vowed to protect and honor, had shattered not just his mother's life, but the trust of the entire family. The betrayal ran deep, and Michael felt the crushing weight of complicity, even if unintentional. He knew he had to make a choice: stand by his wife and allow deceit to continue, or acknowledge the truth and hold her accountable. Margaret's voice, steady and resolute, broke the tension. "Tonight, the truth has been revealed. Lila's actions cannot go unaddressed. Michael, it is time to decide where you stand, not just as a husband, but as a son, and as a man who values honesty and integrity." The room seemed to hold its breath. Lila's expression shifted, her composure faltering as she realized the magnitude of the reckoning. Michael exhaled, gathering his courage, and finally spoke. "Mom is right. This cannot continue. Lila, you have betrayed us all. The house, the trust, the family's things are not yours to manipulate." Lila's eyes filled with panic and desperation, but the words she had rehearsed in her mind for years, the clever deflections, the manipulative reassurances, failed her completely. The family had seen the truth, heard the recordings, and witnessed the undeniable evidence. There was no escape, no room for denial. Margaret felt a bittersweet surge of satisfaction. Justice was not delivered through confrontation alone. It had been earned through careful preparation, patience, and the courage to face a painful betrayal. Lila's downfall was complete, yet the emotional scars it left behind were evident in every family member. Michael's shoulders slumped as he absorbed the consequences, realizing that trust once broken could not easily be restored. The mother-in-law, Margaret, finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "We will take the necessary steps to protect what is ours and ensure that this does not happen again. Lila's actions have consequences, and those consequences must be faced." She looked directly at her daughter-in-law, whose eyes now avoided hers entirely, a silent admission of guilt and defeat. In the quiet aftermath, the family began to navigate the difficult path ahead. Discussions of legal action, restitution, and the preservation of the home took center stage. Michael, though heartbroken, understood that loyalty and love could not excuse manipulation and deceit. The family's foundation had been shaken, but the truth had emerged, allowing them a chance, however fragiletto, rebuild trust. Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The house had been sold, but her dignity remained intact. The betrayal had been exposed, and the family could now confront reality. The path ahead would be challenging, but with honesty as their guide, there was hope for a future where deception could not flourish unchecked. As the night drew to a close, Margaret quietly tidied the living room, glancing at the photographs of her family on the walls. She knew that Lila's presence, once so seemingly integral, had been irreversibly altered. The home, the memories, and the bonds of trust would endure, but vigilance would remain essential. Justice had been served, but the echoes of betrayal would linger, a reminder of the importance of honesty, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of legal consultations, family discussions, and quiet reflection. Margaret, though exhausted, felt a sense of triumph tempered by the emotional toll of betrayal. The house, her lifelong sanctuary, had been defended not merely through law, but through courage, preparation, and undeniable truth. Lila, once a dominant presence in the family, now faced the consequences of her actions in full view of everyone. Michael had spent long hours contemplating the ramifications of his wife's deceit. He felt anger, guilt, and heartbreak, knowing that his trust had been exploited and that his mother had been wronged. Yet he also understood that the path forward required clarity, fairness, and decisiveness. He met with Margaret privately, acknowledging the pain Lila had caused and expressing gratitude for his mother's guidance and perseverance. "Mom, you were right," he admitted, voice heavy with emotion. "I couldn't see it before, but the evidence is clear. We must act responsibly and ensure the truth is acknowledged." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of their shared ordeal, but also the strength that comes from facing betrayal with courage. Together, they decided on the necessary legal actions to reverse or halt any remaining consequences of the house's sale, protecting Margaret's rights and reinforcing that deceit would not go unpunished. The process was challenging, but every document, every recorded admission, and every witness account ensured that justice was firmly on their side. Lila's fall from grace was both public and unavoidable. Word of her manipulations spread through the family and extended social circle, leaving her reputation tarnished and credibility shattered. She attempted in vain to defend herself, but the recordings, signatures, and Margaret's meticulous documentation left no room for plausible deniability. The very people she had sought to control now viewed her with suspicion and disappointment, and she found herself isolated from the family she had once infiltrated so effortlessly. The family dinner where the confrontation had occurred became a turning point. conversations shifted from accusation to reflection, from anger to cautious rebuilding. Michael, though deeply hurt, began to recognize the resilience and wisdom of his mother. Margaret, while still feeling the sting of betrayal, saw the opportunity to restore integrity within her family. The once tense atmosphere gradually softened, though the memory of Lila's actions remained a sobering reminder of the need for vigilance and honesty. Margaret also took time to reflect on the personal impact of the ordeal. The pain of betrayal had been profound, but it had revealed her own strength, patience, and strategic thinking. She had transformed from a shocked victim into a vigilant guardian of her home, rights, and dignity. This journey of resilience not only protected her interests, but also set a precedent for the family that deception would not go unchallenged, and that the bonds of trust, once broken, required accountability to be restored. In private moments, Margaret allowed herself a sense of closure. The house, her lifelong home, remained hers not merely as property, but as a symbol of integrity, perseverance, and justice. Michael, now fully aware of the depth of Lila's betrayal, committed to rebuilding trust with his mother and navigating the difficult path of reconciling his love for his wife with the reality of her actions. It was a delicate balance, but awareness and honesty became their guiding principles. The final resolution came not through anger or vengeance, but through clarity, courage, and the careful presentation of irrefutable evidence. Lila's manipulation had been exposed, her power dismantled, and her credibility destroyed. The family, though shaken, began to heal, learning lessons about trust, vigilance, and the importance of confronting betrayal directly and decisively. As Margaret sat in her living room that evening, gazing at the familiar photos lining the walls, she allowed herself a quiet smile. Justice had been served. The house remained a sanctuary, a symbol of her life's work and the values she had fought to uphold. Though scars remained, both emotional and relational, the family had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united in their commitment to truth and integrity. Margaret knew that the future would still hold challenges, but the betrayal that had once threatened to destroy her home and peace had been confronted, exposed, and ultimately defeated. The battle had been hard fought, but the victory was undeniable, leaving the family with a renewed sense of purpose, trust, and resilience.